Welcome to Finally Game Music, and this is episode 132. I am your host, Kristoffer Schenström, and today we're going to talk about the composer Junko Ozawa. So, as a beginning, as we usually do with the composers, we're digging deep into who the composer are, where they come from, and so on. And when you're actually comparing Junko to other composers of her time in her area of expertise, it is quite unique to see a person who worked for a single company their entire career. And we're looking at a composer here that have worked on composing for this company for about 25 years. Composers Today says that she is the one that made the original form of Namco sound that continues to be used today. But first of all, let's start from the beginning. There ain't a lot of information about Junko on her younger days, and there's quite rare for a composer of her caliber, but this could be because of different kinds of factors and such. But looking at Junko, she was born in Saitama Prefecture in Japan, and this was on the 8th of June, and somewhere, and this is just a wild guess on my part based on information that I've gotten during the research, but between 1962 and 64, I've actually seen some people discuss if she's around 1959, the year she was born. But looking at Junko, she has only worked for one company, which we already gotten back to, but we will tell a little bit more about her background in just a couple of seconds. But looking and going through this information, there's no specific information of where she studied or what she did and such that led up into the employment. But it wasn't actually a game that led into employment for Junko, but instead it was a robot that tempted her to get in contact then with this Japanese company Namco. So it all began through a Micromouse Championship. A Micromouse Championship is basically a competition where amateurs build small robots that would race through a maze to go out of it in the shortest amount of time. And Namco was sponsoring this special event back in 1980, which was early 80s, where Junko actually started beginning working for the company in the end. But you saw Namco's own little robot mouse, which called Nyamko. So it's kind of a nya. Everybody heard of Nyamkat today. I'm most definitely sure about that one, but Nyamko. And she definitely fell in love with it at first sight. And after visiting this event, she started thinking about getting a job after school, and she learned that the company Namco, who made the Nyamko robot, was looking for a student majoring in music. And this can tell that she was actually studying and got a degree in music in some sort of way. And she said at this point that Nyamko is calling to me. And she went to get this position. Everything went good with exams and everything. Needed to get the first employment. And the first game she was working on back in the day was for the game The Tower of Druaga back in June 1984. And the game was first released on arcade. So we're going to listen to a Game Boy version, because we don't play that much Game Boy on this podcast, so I think it's time for us to kind of up that game. So let's go for The Tower of Druaga and the song Congratulant Message. And there we have the melody from the song Congratulant Message from the game The Tower of Druaga. So the game, it was initially released for the arcade, but was later ported to many different platforms. But a few that was released within the first 3 years of the initial release for the arcade were the Nintendo Entertainment System, Game Boy, the FM7, and Sharp MZ 80,000, and apparently there are multiple versions of the Sharp here as well that were able to play the Tower of Druaga game as well. And also this game also released some newer versions of the game as well. So the newer consoles were like GameCube back in 2003, but also was released on the digital download for eShop, so you were able to get this game on Wii, Wii U, and the Nintendo 3DS. And looking at the credits here for Druaga, then Junko was actually credited as Junko Ozawa. So they kind of threw around her name a little bit, kept some and just changed a couple of letters. So I kind of found it interesting to just see these different names, because it's always fun to get to know Japanese composers back in the day when they had just crazy weird names in the credits list. But there's some more information going down to this. So looking at the information here when she started out, so Junko first started working at Namco, and it did not feel like a company at all, but more like as a club in a high school or in a college. So the seniors of this company and the bosses of them were just in their 20s when they started. The development room and the desks, they were just full of computers, toys, musical instruments, and other things that people at the company found interesting. So when she started, she actually had to stay quiet over the fact that she were a developer at Namco, and this was because everything had to be done in secret. Because if people told that they were working with games, then they were told that they would basically get kidnapped, and then they would be asked for your ideas for a new game in place of a ransom instead. However, she does not know if this was actually true or not. So, looking at this first game, The Tower of Druaga, she actually programmed and used her own sound driver and wrote her own music. The sound driver was specifically made for the music, a program where it was like sheet music when she made the music. It reads the data and then plays the music. And originally her music was ported to the NES by Nobuyuki Onogi, but when he left Namco, she had to start porting her own music, and all the code that she used to write for her own music was through the code base assembly. And it was kind of welcome from the part of Namco here, because instead of going through another instance of another person working on the music, it was much better that Junko worked on all the different versions herself, because they overall got better results. And Junko herself, she thinks the 8-bit sounds is a little bit cheap, but it does have its own character, and at the same time she does think it as a musical instrument. And between the years of 1984 and 1988, she worked on music for arcade or NES primarily, but in 1994 she made a jump over to the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis as she made the music for the latest game in the installment of Pac-Man, Pac-Man 2: The New Adventures. After that one, she started working on her first PlayStation title, named Cyber Sled. And here, Junko takes a deep dive into the music with amazing compositions. And the next game that's coming up after Cyber Sled is our honorable stop for the next song. So we're going to listen to Vision 3-1, Rebirth of the Forest, from the game Klonoa: Door to Panthermile. Yeah, and I dedicate this song to Ulol, who sent me a message that we just had to pick a song from a Klonoa game, and I usually try to avoid popular titles for the larger composers, but I think this one is unavoidable when it comes to Junko, because this is one of her most amazing works according to gamers of my generation. So this was Vision 3-1 Rebirth of the Forest from Klonoa: Door to Panthermile, and I really enjoyed this song because it kind of gave almost like a shop but also kind of a launch kind of vibe to it. It was kind of sweet, it was simple, and I really did enjoy this one. So looking at the beginning here, Junko was the sole in-house composers of Namco, and over time the team grew, and so did the in-house composer section as well. And for Klonoa, we had quite some composers, a size you might have for their games today. So looking at the Klonoa soundtrack here, and I'm so going to botch some of these names, and I'm so sorry for that, but we have the Japanese Emiko Imura, Kanako Kakino, Tetsukasu Nakinishi, Koto Takahashi, Hiroshi Okubo, Hiromi Shibano, Tomoko Tatsuta, Takaki Hirogyon, and of course, Junko Ozawa. So looking at Klonoa and the release date here, we have the 11th of December 1997, and that was released in Japan at first. And the year after, we also had a release in both Europe and the US. The game was also released digitally on the PS3, PSP, and PS Vita through the PSN store. And after the first game of Klonoa, she started working on a soccer game called Libero Grande. But after that one, she continued to make music for Pac-Man, but also to the Klonoa series. And in 2000, she makes music for the first Mr. Driller game, which stars out the whole other franchise of Namco. And in 2003, she makes the intro music for her first rhythm game, the Nintendo GameCube game Donkey Konga. So we're going to enjoy and listen to the opening theme. Donkey Konga! Yeah! The intro to the game Donkey Konga, and this game was it was a very popular game that I remember at least, and it was much like another popular rhythm game, Dance Dance Revolution, but instead of using your feet, you were using your hands to play bongos. And the original sound for this game was made by Junko and another person credited as a G-Son. And the game, it was released the 12th of December 2003, and this was in Japan yet again, and the next year after the rest of the world got it for GameCube, which the game was exclusively released for. And the only memory I have of this game is actually playing this one at the world's greatest LAN party, DreamHack, here in Sweden. And I just remember this gotta be like 2005 or 6 at least. And they had only one controller, and I do remember it being a little bit broken because there were so many people that had banged it before us. And I still enjoy the game. I had fun with it, but today, looking at Donkey Konga, it kind of reminds me of this Taiko no, the drumming game with another, like, Japanese kind of a drum-esque kind of thing. I don't remember. It's something Taiko something. I do remember it's Namco as well to make that game. So maybe Donkey Konga was the first interpretation of what became Taiko in the end. And Taiko is a freaking amazing arcade machine to play on. So I definitely would love to see a Donkey Konga machine as well. Maybe there is one, but it would be amazing to see one for real. Not just on a picture and such. But looking at the game, back again over to Donkey Konga here, there's a small number of original compositions here, as the game is just filled with famous music from other Nintendo titles, but also famous mainstream music that you could usually hear on the radio. And there are unique lists both for Japan, but the US and Europe, so there are 3 different song lists for this game. And looking at Junko when it came to the music and making the music and sound effects, Junko always had a fair amount of creative freedom when it came to the music and the sound effects for the games that she worked on. But there were no strict instructions for her, so she usually got an okay on her first time when making the music or the sound effect. But there were some times where people basically said that's not quite right, and she had to remake the sounds. And there are only a few more games that I could find in her entire credit list that were not developed primarily by Namco. So we have the wrestling game, the WWE Day of Reckoning 2, back from 2005, and Pets Cats 2 from 2007. These games were developed by another company, but Namco Sound Team did the work for the music specifically in these cases. And for the game Katamari Damacy, back from 2004, Junko is not just credited as the composer, but also the voice actor for one of the characters in the game. However, as much as I looked for it, I did not find anything about the character which he is credited for, so I'm a little bit unsure on that one, but the official what I could find is that she has voiceover actor credits. And well, when we're looking back on the track here, after Donkey Konga, she was working on Katamari Damacy, and then again for Donkey Konga, the second installation, so Donkey Konga 2, and during 2006, she started to revisit and rework a lot of games and the music for them, such as Pac-Man, the new Rally X, Dig Dug, and Sevius, which initially has released games way earlier. So I'm basically thinking that these are remakes of some kind. Maybe she is recredited. So looking at these type of games as well, none of these she was initially composed by Junko either, so it's kind of interesting to see her go back and rework music as well. Maybe she only worked on just making up to shape and stuff like that. I'm a little bit unsure on that. But all these games she worked on sound effect, basically. Now we're getting to the end of her career, though. So let's listen to the music from one of the last games she originally worked on. So we're going to listen to track 17 from the game The Dog Island. There we have the last track of the week, The Dog Island and track 13. I don't know specifically if Junko's the one who worked on this specific theme, because there's a lot of themes or tracks for this soundtrack, and no composer on this soundtrack were credited specifically for these ones, and there's not super much information about the game either, so they only credited the whole Namco team going forward on this game. So the soundtrack here was composed by Etsuo Ishii, Minamo Takahashi, Junichi Nakaseru, Ryo Hamamoto, Yoshihito Yano, Tetsuya Ushuida, Tomomitsu Kaneko, and Junko Ozawa. The game was developed by the Japanese company Yuka's Company, and the game was released for both PlayStation 2 and the Nintendo Wii back in 2007 in Japan, and in 2008 the rest of the world. And as I once stated before, the soundtrack was made by the Namco sound team. And after working at Namco for over 25 years, Junko retires back in September 2008, with her work for the re-releases of Klonoa happening in 2008 for the Nintendo Wii. And she worked at that title as a sound supervisor. And looking at the rest of her credits list, she actually has another game named, and the last credit that she does have on her list is for the remake Katamari Damacy. It's called the same, they just added reroll at the end, so she's yet again credited as voice actor, and that game was released back in 2018. So it was super interesting going through Junko's music, her career, and getting a little bit of a glimpse into where she started and where she kind of ended up. It's kind of sad to see her go, but she left a legacy when it comes to music, and there's a lot of people that really found her music inspiring and took inspiration of her when they became either composers or when they worked on the music. And there's a lot of people in interviews naming Junko as a great foundation when starting the Namco sound team as well. So it's super interesting to see so much information about her, talking and people giving back and crediting her for the inspirations that she's given. It's just sad that we couldn't read more about where she actually came from and getting more glimpse into each and every one. I did go through digging into the cards, the Red Bull TV series, where they basically talk and do interviews with composers and a whole lot more. I would definitely leave those in the main post, so you guys can look at them as well if you missed those. But also, if you want to read more and get more things on Junko, you can read her full interviews and so on, which I only use to cross-reference certain items here when going through and researching. So I do everybody enjoy this episode this week, because it was super interesting for me. I just hope I can convey the super interesting part to you guys listening to this podcast. And also, I want to give a big sorry as well, because last week I did not check my information and setups for my microphone, so the sound quality is hopefully way better this week than it was last week, so I'm so sorry for that one. I will keep that in mind for every podcast coming up further into the future as well. So other episodes of Finally Game Music, you can find those on our homepage videospelsklubben.se. You can find us on Spotify or in your closest podcast app. Feel free to follow and give us a comment on any of our social medias, such as Facebook or Instagram, and I'm starting to change everything, so you can find us on Finally Game Music on Instagram at least. I'm trying to figure it out on Facebook as well, but other than that, you can find us with Äntligen Spelmusik as well. You have everything information in Spotify or in the podcast app if you are a little bit unsure. So if you would like to hear your name within one of these podcasts, then feel free to either request a song for an upcoming episode by commenting on any of our social media pages or through Discord. So it's easy for me to follow up and read these comments as well. I'm super excited to always get information and get comments on what you think, and if you're recommending this podcast as well. I had one of the listeners, Bedroth, actually sending me a message that he recommends people to listen to it, and I was almost touched to tears because it struck me so hard in the chest. It was so beautiful. So thank you so much, Bedroth, for reaching out and saying that you love and enjoy the podcast. So other ways you can otherwise support this podcast, you can become a Patreon to support future content, the quality updates. I'm starting to feel that my headphones are starting to crack up a little bit. They're getting old, so I'm starting to get. I need to get new equipment soon as well. But if you want to support the quality and the content of this podcast, then keep in mind that you can become a Patreon, and link to that one will be found in the main post, or else you can just find us by searching for Finally Game Music on Patreon. So some of our, or all of our amazing backers today are Mikael Sjöberg, Andreas Nilsson, Daniel Onemark. So thank you so freaking much for backing up this project and this child of mine, I would say, the podcast Finally Game Music. And links where you can either buy or support Junko, who's behind the music. I will try to get as much information as possible into the main post of Videospelsklubben.se. So the next theme for the next episode, I wanted to talk about a little more about a specific game. It's been a while since we did one of those deep dives into the soundtrack of one specific game. We usually deep dive in composers, or we listen to a whole lot of things depending on the thematic, but we're going to listen to the soundtrack for Asterix and Obelix for the Super Nintendo next week. So hope you all had a great Easter, everybody's taking care and having a good time, so I'll see you all next time.